Local productions seen on Delta College Public Media are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Mike Redford, and this is the follow-up. Coming up on tonight's show, the UAW strike against the Big Three is now in its second month, shutting down operations at dozens of plants and putting thousands of people on the picket lines. What are some of the biggest issues holding up a contract settlement, and which plants are targeted for closure next, leading to additional worker walkouts? We'll have insight from two automotive reporters working the front lines of the strike and hear from a former automotive supplier manager who has a personal perspective from a bargaining table of the past. But first, we would like to hear from you, our viewers, to help drive the conversation here on the show. You can do that in a variety of ways via social media on Facebook. You can dial into our follow-up hotline to voice your opinion or suggest future show topics. And you can comment through YouTube. And if you'd like to watch any of our past shows, you can just log on to deltacollegepublicmedia.org. As for tonight's show, our guests, we have Lindsay Moore. She is a reporter with MLive. She has dialed in remote, along with Michael Martinez. He is a reporter for Automotive News. If you recall, they joined us a few weeks back when this strike first started, and we're glad to have you guys back. Appreciate it. A lot going on. And in studio, I have my good friend Gary Loster, former Saginaw mayor and president of Loster Group Consulting. Very skilled individual. Looking forward to what you have to say. So let's get into it. So the Anderson Economics Group out of Lansing says this strike has cost $7.7 billion, the costliest automotive strike in history. That's a mouthful. They're calling it a danger zone here in week 5, day 33, taking its toll on suppliers, manufacturers, and the workers too, obviously, kind of 5 weeks in, who are just now getting their strike pay. Pressure's mounting on both sides. The fallout is getting dire. So Lindsay, let me just start with you. What are you hearing out there as an MLive reporter? What do you make of kind of where we're at? Will the fact we're getting to this sort of dire situation financially, is that going to move the dial at all?
Yeah, well, I mean, 7.7 billion is a scary number, right? That already surpasses what the original estimate for this strike was going to be, even if they would have struck all three simultaneously. So, it's a behemoth of a strike. We knew that from the beginning, that they were going to target all three, big three, but in a more strategic way. And I do think that danger zone in particular, Anderson Economics Group pointed out that it's a danger zone for suppliers, that, Sean Fain and the UAW have been very targeted at what points in the supply chain they're hitting, and parts distribution was a big hit. And so I do think that we're starting to see, those dominoes are falling. Early on there was a survey amongst suppliers, and about 30% of them said that if this continues, there will be layoffs if there hasn't already been. And I think dealerships are getting to the point of being pinched too. We talked to some of those dealerships across the state here at MLive, and a lot of them said that while they still have some new cars on the lot, that if this goes into November, they are definitely going to be, seeing a lot of empty spaces. And even more so, I think getting your car fixed is going to be the first thing that's going to get harder and harder to do.
And Michael, too, we talked about this before the show. Then there's the striking workers themselves. They're in day 33. They're just now getting strike pay, which is $500 a week, which is a third of what they've been getting. So you wonder if they're getting to the point, are they impatient, frustrated? Are they questioning strategy at all? Or do you think by and large they're saying, we're sticking to it. We're in it for the long haul?
That's interesting. I actually talked with some of those workers who have been out there since day one at the Michigan Assembly Plant in Wayne. That's Ford's plant that builds the Bronco and the Ranger pickup. And the ones I talked to essentially said that they are still in this for as long as it takes, and they have faith and trust in their union leadership right now based on everything they've done over these past 5 weeks. They think they're really hitting the companies hard, and they're working hard to get everything they want and everything they've promised the workers they would fight for. There's a few of them that are getting a little tired. As you said, 5 weeks in, $500 a week in strike pay, you have to watch what you put in the grocery cart. You maybe don't go out to the movies. You maybe don't do a lot of things you would otherwise do. Hopefully you have some savings to hold you over. But this is finally getting real for a lot of people. The hype maybe has died down a bit, and the weather's getting colder, when you're really getting into the nitty-gritty here.
Gary, let me come to you with your expertise, because you were a former automotive supplier manager with what was Saginaw Steering Gear, became Delphi. You've been part of these kinds of sort of negotiations. So talk to me about that perspective. What kind of are we seeing now that make it maybe compare to what you kind of went through back in the day?
Well, back in the day, it was certainly different, I think, Mike, Lindsay, in terms of where we are today. But one of the things that we had talked about prior to, and I'd love to get Lindsay and Mike's perspective on the UAW chairman, Finn, if you will. How do you see him in terms of being strategic in everything he's moving forward to now? Because back in the day, of course, we had the negotiations, and we would supply our leaders with the information, and then they would give it back to us to be able to pursue, to bring it back to them. But I find that today, with the leadership of the UAW now, it's much more aggressive, it's much more strategic in their thinking, and particularly when it relates to the plant closures. Back in the day, we had all the plants was closed at one time. He just struck everybody. But this unique perspective of this guy is something that really looks a lot different, and he's a thinker as opposed to the old days. The guys just get out, and they just had the signs up, Mike. They had a good time. They'd run down to the local bar, have a few, come back, and go to the strike. But this strike is different to me. So I'd love to get your perspective on his leadership as to how he's doing the union strike now.
Go ahead, guys. Who wants to take that? Lindsay?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think strategy is key here. I mean, he came out with a war plan, right? I mean, he wasn't going to do this like it was done before, and that was from even before negotiations started, right? He threw out the ceremonial handshake between him and CEOs, and he went right to workers to kind of gain their support because he's a new president and he won by a slim margin, and he's earning their trust and their respect throughout this. And I think you see that even, he's kind of a soft-spoken guy if you just catch him out, but once he's in front of a crowd, he gets riled up. And I think he knows that he is trying to lead the troops in that way. And I do think it's strategic because they didn't go with a pattern agreement. They said, we're going to go for all three, and each individual table is an individual negotiation. And to some effect, they are then pitting them against each other, right? Because they're negotiating in public. I think that's the most unique thing. Obviously, it's historic to go after the big three. It's historically the most expensive, as we've talked about. But to do this on a Facebook Live every Friday to tell you what plants are closing, that is something totally new and, completely, that's Sean Fain's legacy now, I think. Well, maybe I'm speaking too soon. We'll see how this all ends.
I agree.
Well, speaking of negotiating in public, which is a great segue, because just this week, as you know, Ford executive, Henry Ford's great-grandson, Bill Ford, lashed out sort of publicly, as you said, negotiating a little bit in the public, saying the longer this goes, it opens the door to their global competitors, Toyota, Honda, Tesla, among others, and it will hinder their own investment growth in the future. So what do you make of sort of Bill Ford's rather uncharacteristic and very public statement and the message he wants the UAW to hear? Michael, you want to touch that?
Sure. I was at the Rouge factory yesterday when Bill made those statements, and that was a big moment for the company. They don't trot the executive chair out every day. He had to consciously decide to do this, and he did it because he wanted to really elevate the conversation. You've seen a lot of rhetoric from both sides, really, especially the unions willing to get in the dirt and go at the companies directly, which is part of this new strategy. And Bill Ford said he wanted to elevate the conversation and really provide a bigger picture perspective, right? We're not just talking about Ford versus the union. We're not talking about GM and Stellantis versus the union. He argues that this needs to be bigger than that because the future of the domestic auto industry could be at stake because you have a lot of non-union competitors, folks like Tesla or Toyota or Volkswagen, Honda, down the list, who don't have the same kind of labor costs that the Detroit Three have. And if the union does push and does hold out for a lot more, the companies are saying they're at their limit. That will have actual consequences. It may not just be rhetoric. You could see less investment. You could see those non-union rivals take even more market share that they have already been taking from the Detroit Three. So he's trying to send out a warning and trying to get some type of resolution here as soon as possible.
See, I think that's a good point, because that's what I was thinking. He was kind of saying to them, listen, the longer this goes, we're not as competitive. We can't sell as many cars. You might lose more UAW members in the long run.
It's true.
So be careful what you wish for. Gary?
I concur with that, because as you look at it again, when I think about what he is doing, he's elevating the conversation to a new level. I think before it was sort of been at just a mediocre type discussion with the three CEOs, Mike, but I think that he took it to another level, realizing that the share in terms of the share for the America's big three, as opposed to Toyota, those guys, and the market share was already down going into the strike. And now with the strike conditions being what they are, and as long as they're going, it now has another impact on what the market share will look like for the big three. So I think it's very important.
Do you guys think at all that Fane could change strategy midstream? What I'm saying, kind of what you brought up, Gary, that strategically he's done something different as opposed to targeting one automaker, cutting a deal. Once he does that, then he runs to the other two and say, what do you think of that? Do you think it's too late for him to say, to target one automaker now, or he's just going to play this card and I'm going to play all three and see how it goes?
I think it's a good question.
Good
question. You caught me making a.
I'm just thinking out of the box here a little bit, but.
Right. But I mean, already we went 2 Fridays without a strike target, right? And both times he told us, oh, we just made, we were just talking to folks at whatever the big three was at the moment, and said they came to the table with this, so we're not, we're sparing them, right? We saw first with Stellantis, they got spared after doing all of the parts and customer care centers. That was a huge hit for GM and Ford. And then GM got spared when they put out the EV kind of carrot, I'll call it. That was huge. Right. And then most recently went the other direction when he said, this is the UAW's version of events, that they walked into the table with Ford and said, what's your latest economic proposal? They didn't hear what they wanted, and they took out the Kentucky plant. So I think everything's on the table with Shawn Fain. And he himself said most recently, the strategy's changing. I'm not giving you a heads up anymore. And that goes for us folks in the media as well. We are also constantly on our heels, ready to spin in the other direction.
So are some of the issues that we talked about at the very beginning, have they changed at all? And we do have a graphic. And Bob, why don't you throw that up about, these are some of what they were going through that was from the very beginning. Have any of these changed? Kind of the more pay, they came out of the gate with, wanted to go 40% over 4 years, which I think, Michael, you said earlier that's changed. That's probably gone down to maybe 23 or 25. End of the tiered employment, sort of better employment benefits overall, and then worker protections in the EV world. So, Michael, as you look at that and in the world you live in, working on the lines, have some of these changed, or has the union maybe softened on some of this, in your opinion?
It doesn't sound like they have. The companies are offering as much as 23%. The union still wants 40. It's still pushing for 40 or in that ballpark. At one point, I had reported that they had come down to 36, right? And this is all sort of fluid, right? If you take some money from one pot, you can put it in another, so that sort of changes. But you look at Shawn Fain's strategy and you talk about that, it's worked for the most part. The companies have agreed to really high double-digit wages. They've agreed to end the tiered wage system, at least in a certain definition. We could get into that if you want. They've agreed to a lot of the union's asks. A few of the outstanding remaining ones, battery plants are going to be really big. GM allegedly agreed to something. We don't know any details yet. It could be big. It could be huge news for the industry moving forward. But I think it's too early to say that just because the details aren't out there. Retirement security is another key sticking point. The union continues to demand pensions, and the companies are saying, we're not going to go back to defined benefit pensions. We'll sweeten your 401k plan. We'll add some sweeteners into the current pension plans for the older workers that already have them, but we're not going back to pensions across the board. So it could still drag out on those few issues, but we're getting closer on some of the other stuff.
That brings up a good point, Mike. Mike, is it true that the retirees have not had a raise in 5 to 10 years on the retires of their pension plan? Now, somebody did mention that the other day, that they hadn't had any addition to their existing pension plan in 10 years or a decade.
That's a big deal.
That's huge.
Yeah.
because
Exactly.
they're getting a lot of pressure from the retirees who have not had that, so they want to ensure. So that is a pressure point for Fain as he moves forward with this process as well.
Good point. One area we didn't touch on that list, I think they keep asking, one of the demands is that 32-hour work week, which I think some of us get chafed at, like, are you kidding me? But, and in talking to Lindsay earlier, so Lindsay, maybe you got a little perspective on that, while some of us kind of go, really, 32 hours a week? I wouldn't mind that. But there's two sides of that. So why don't you take some of that, because there are two sides to that.
There are, and I don't think you're wrong there. I think that's the kitchen table discussion I've heard most so far, of 32 hours and a pay raise. I want that, and I think we get into this competitive mode of like, why should you get that if I don't get that? We've been talking that the public opinion of the UAW specifically is very high right now. Like 75% of Americans surveyed by Gallup said that they are with the auto workers when it comes to this fight with the big three. But that 32-hour work week does seem to be the rub. And so I was talking to labor economists about this, about what would that look like in practice, and also, is this a pie in the sky demand? And they brought up a great point that shifted my perspective, which is, what is the union's role if not to move the needle on what working place and working conditions look like? And I think, a lot of what we just talked about, COLA, pensions, retirement, it feels like something of the past, but it's also, something that has been a boiling point with the UAW for quite a while. And so if they're going to make big swings, why not make big swings for the future as well? And they really might change, a pattern here for all working people. And I think we're seeing that frustration bubble over, especially after COVID. We see nurses, teachers. Right now we have a Blue Cross Blue Shield strike happening in Michigan. We just saw the casino workers walk out. I think a lot of people are saying, what should work-life balance be? And 32 hours sounds crazy right now, but 40-hour work weeks sounded crazy. And that's what the UAW really helped fight for, it amongst other unions.
So, Gary, I'd love to hear you follow up on that, given your sort of experience and with an automotive supplier, working with UAW workers, and the culture of the labor movement where we are.
I was just going to say that, Mike. I was going to ask Lindsay or Mike, back in the day, showing my age, where the chairman has a different leadership style, whereas back in the old days, the union guys were out of hand, they were enjoying themselves, and they were all over the place. But this guy, with his strategy, there have been no hiccups at all during the labor movement at all. There have been no issues at all. So he has really laid down the gauntlet as to how the union participation at the strike site, this is what you should do and this is how you should handle yourselves. That's completely different than what I've been accustomed to back in the day. So I just keep thinking about how this guy is not only a leader, but he's an excellent manager, and he's laying out the strategy to the leadership that we're not going to tolerate anything above and beyond just being out there picketing, because he has a vision and he has a strategic plan that's going to go beyond, because it's just bigger than this. This guy's looking at the impact nationwide, and it's been different than what I've been accustomed to in the past. So I'm really enamored by how he's handling things, and I think he's going to be a star going forward. But then looking at the other corporations, Lindsay, in terms of adopting what the UAW does, and I've seen that in the days gone by, that whatever he gets, of course, that's going to be emulated by different companies going forward. But the electronic vehicle, the EVs and all of that is quite different. And then I've not heard too much in this, and perhaps Mike or you have, about the move to Mexico in terms of the wages that they get. And I know when we were at Steering Gear, the $2.50 an hour wage was because, and particularly in, I can't remember where in Mexico, but the $2.50 wage was because the state did not allow you in Mexico, let's say Chihuahua or Jalisco, to pay more than what the community could stand. So I've not heard a lot about the Mexico plants in this.
Interesting. Yeah,
Sure,
a good perspective. And the other thing I'm thinking about, Michigan got rid of right to work under Governor Whitmer. And this has been coming at a time when the UAW ranks overall had been sort of dwindling. And then we brought back, we removed right to work. And so, and I'd love to hear Michael and Lindsay get your thoughts on that, because how does Michigan stand now? Now that we made a change by getting rid of right to work, are we looking at Michigan differently? Now they're striking, here we go again in Michigan, and that's going to tarnish other development, recruiting other businesses to Michigan because of this strike. Michael?
I think that's part of the concern here, is that the longer this work stoppage lasts, the further impact it has on the suppliers, on economic development, that maybe people won't be as likely to come to Michigan or look elsewhere. But I would like to make maybe two quick points to what Gary said, because I think it is very notable in terms of how this strike has unfolded, the discipline that the union has shown, not only with the rank and file, but with the leadership too. You have to keep in mind, a lot of these leaders, including the vice presidents who are at the bargaining tables, came from competing caucuses. They had elections earlier this year. Obviously, Shawn Fain and some of the Reform Caucus won a lot of these board seats, a lot of these positions of power. But you have some incumbents still left over. Chuck Browning from Ford is one such example. He's the vice president. They've all worked together. They've acted as one fist, so to speak. And that's important. But moving forward here, the union needs to present that kind of united front. They need to show this type of strength, because Shawn Fain's going to go after those other automakers that Bill Ford mentioned. After these negotiations are done, could fail. They have failed often in the past, but he's going to make a run at organizing Tesla, organizing Toyota, some of the non-union plants. So he needs the union to be in the public mindset, to be in that zeitgeist, and to have momentum to carry forward.
I see that, and you're right, Mike, because I'm thinking at Saginaw Steering Gear back in the day, in the North we had the union leadership. At the South and the Alabama plants, they were right to work. Mm-hmm. So the difference was the leadership there as opposed to here, and you hit that exactly where I want to go. It looks like when he sits at the table, at least what I've saw on the news, it's completely different. This guy commands a president. I'm just fascinated with him and his leadership, because everyone seems to be working together, because he's seeing the bigger picture. It's about the UAW now. It's about the General Motors plants, but there are other UAW programs that are in different places who are non-GM. So I can see this going further, as you said, Mike, and I just see that this guy is going to work this all the way through. He's starting with General Motors and Ford and Chrysler and Stellantis now. But in the long run, Mike, it's going to be a lot different in terms of how we look at negotiations, how we look at leadership within the union. He's more polished, more professional, and he has a strategy in place that he's going somewhere with this, and he's going to get there with this group, and they're in harmony. They're not separate. They're in harmony.
I would make the quick point, if I could, that the automakers are growing a little frustrated with this strategy. They're arguing a lot of it is preordained, predestined, that no matter what they do, this strike was going to unfold almost because it had to. Shawn Fain needs to keep up this support. So there's some argument there. Almost, the companies are almost saying negotiate in bad faith. They have not reached that point, but they've made some very strong statements. They're getting frustrated with a lot of what he's doing. But at least from an optics standpoint, the union looks strong. The union looks like it's winning right now, and that's what really matters in terms of their ability to organize and move forward.
I agree.
Yeah, and public opinion in a new Gallup poll just this week said that more Americans, by and large, support the union over the automakers, and that's got to help. The other thing I will mention, that it wasn't too long ago, there was a pretty dark cloud with the UAW. A lot of their leadership was caught.
Yes.
Corruption, improprieties.
Yes.
It was pretty ugly, right?
Yes.
And now, a couple of years in the future here, now we've got, I think they've changed the perception a little bit here, and that's been working in their favor. They've done that pretty quickly. He's done a good job of that. Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah. They change the optics really quick. I mean, not only is it Shawn Fain's kind of introduction and earning respect of the membership, but I think right now the UAW is trying to gain, public support and then kind of prove their value, right? To say, if these are the demands we're putting on the table, we need this majority of Americans to be with us when we keep going with it. And to the point too that we haven't seen the kind of flare ups on the picket line. We like your point, we've seen kind of rank and file within leadership, even though they came from different points of view on that. I think all of this, I mean, again, we're coming from a guy who's quoting not only Walter Reuther but MLK and Malcolm X. He is there to really fire people up. He came with a personality. And I do think I've been asking folks too, will this spur more unionization? Will this spur more organization in general? And I do think, to your point, Mike, about right to work finally being repealed in Michigan after many years, I think we're just starting to tip that and see what happens, because right now the statistics are, unionization numbers are quite low still, despite all these headlines and these strikes. Organization levels are not where they historically were, although Michigan, often leads the pack nationally. It's still quite low. So this is a real moment, I think, to see. It's a litmus test, so to speak.
Right. We got about 2 minutes left. Automotive reporters, what's next for you in the next couple of days? Do you await Sean Fain to have another Facebook Live on Friday and see what his next move is, or what are some other angles that you guys are kind of thinking about while this strike continues?
Yeah, I mean, it used to be my usual Friday morning schedule was waiting for Sean Fain to tell me what happens next, but I guess that's a fool's errand now that he's told us that he will no longer be telling us a play-by-play. But I think back to the point that Mike made, that these workers now, especially some folks like, in Wayne, for instance, and across the country at those first big 3 plants that went down, I think really focusing in on them now that we are rounding out into the fifth week, and how are they feeling right now, because they are the ones that take the hit first and foremost. And I think that's where our reporting has to center on now, because it's so much back and forth, and we're just waiting from both UAW and Big Three to tell us where they're at.
What about you, Michael? What's on tap the next day or two?
I would look out. This isn't any reporting. I'm just saying I would look out for potential next moves against big plants at GM and Stellantis, big truck plants, big SUV plants, because ultimately, if Sean Fain's going to take a deal to members to vote on, he needs them to think that he pushed the companies to the limits. And we saw that with Kentucky Truck. That really hurts Ford. It's its biggest, most profitable plant. He's going to need to do that at GM and Stellantis eventually before he can tell members, hey, I fought him as hard as I could go, and this is what we could get.
Excellent. Well, Michael Martinez, Lindsay Moore, keep up the good work on the front lines. I promise I won't bring you on too much, but you do such a good job, and we may have to do it again. So keep your cell phones on. So thank you very much. Great work. And Gary Loster, as always,
thank you, Mike.
Appreciate your expertise.
Thank you.
And that's our show for tonight, but be sure to join us again next week for the follow-up. We'll have 2 economists talking about all kinds of things, inflation and interest rates. That's next week. Have a good night.